During the month of July 1977, many reports of giant living thunderbirds were pouring into newspaper offices and TV stations across central Illinois. I, Chief AJ of the Central Tribal Native American Council, was called upon by CBS television to try to film a living thunderbird. I had been trained by the United States Marine Corps to be a combat photographer. CBS had called on me many times in the past to film major fires. I had produced good films for CBS, delivering to them network quality results. I studied a map of central Illinois where the Thunderbird sightings had been happening and decided to cruise by canoe the remote shoreline of Lake Shelbyville. I had my 16mm news camera loaded with 100 feet of professional Ektachrome film. You are now seeing the original footage of living flying thunderbirds straight out of Native American legends. This footage has been studied by several universities since July 1977, and the following television show is one of the interesting results. Let it fly.
Lawndale, Illinois, the 25th of July, 1977. A month when there were 10 storms. 3 little boys playing hide and seek in the backyard. Easy targets for 2 huge birds which suddenly swooped down from the sky. One of the birds made straight for 10-year-old redhead Marlon Lowe.
I took off running, and all I know is I just felt something just grabbed me by my shirt and picked me up off the ground. I just looked up and there was this great big old bird, so I just started beating on it. And when I started beating on it, it carried me from that corner of the house, that corner right there, to the corner of this house here, and I was screaming. And then I was beating on this bird.
The child's scream summoned his mother. She saw his legs dangling and grabbed them. The bird dropped its prey. But how could it have lifted a child weighing 65 pounds? Zoologist Jeremy Rayner of Bristol University is an expert in the biomechanics of birds in flight.
Supposing a bird came down and tried to pick up a child, it wouldn't be touching the ground itself, so it couldn't use its legs to jump. It would have to keep all the movement going with its wings. It'd have to make some quite vigorous, large amplitude wing beats. If it's carrying its own weight, travelling quite slowly, and the weight of the child, it's quite likely it could get a few feet and then just have to give up. That may be what Marlon is telling us happened. Here we've got a story of a bird which is very much larger than anything we're used to, flying with somebody who weighs at least as much as it already weighs, if not more. And that's hard to understand alongside any bird we know now.
Five days after the little boy's terrifying experience, a former U.S. Marine combat cameraman went fishing in a creek 50 miles from Marlon's home. John Huffer thought he knew the wildlife here.
Then when I got about here, I was in good vision of those 2 trees. And when I looked back here in that tree and I saw those 2 huge birds, I put down my fishing equipment and I got my 16mm camera, and that bird was sitting up there in that tree, and I started that camera, and at the sound of that whirling, the 2 birds took off, and I saw a wingspan on those 2 birds. It was between 18 and 20 feet, and the claws that came down from those birds were huge. They went right over the top of me, and they flew
over these trees. Now, one bird was a lot bigger than the other, and I figured that he was a big male, and I shot the whole 100 foot of film, and I had it all in focus, and everybody could get a good idea of how large those big birds were.
The bird Huffer describes is twice as big as the largest bird known to modern science. The film he shot that day is now subjected to scientific analysis by the zoologist. Dr. Rayner is hoping to work on an identification. It's not easy.
When you see a bird simply against a background, there's no scale. Even when you see it among trees, you can't really tell how far away it is. It could be a large bird far away or a small bird quite close. You need some sort of reference, and that is not present in this film.
Without fixed points against which to make comparisons, it's hard for Dr. Rayner to make an accurate identification. He looks first at the form and movement of the big bird's wings.
The cues we've got to identify this bird, the way it moves its wings, the general shape of the bird and its wings. The tail is quite long and straight, and relatively narrow. That suggests it isn't a very large species. Nearly all the large birds this might be, vultures and eagles, have got triangular-shaped tails. But the other cue is that it's flapping its wings continually. If it's a very large bird, it simply can't flap all the time. They don't have enough energy and the muscles can't do it. When the bird glides, the wings are held nearly flat, a slight upward turn, and vultures, the obvious alternative species for this is the black or the turkey vulture. They glide with a very steeply inclined wing, the wings held upwards in a V. That's not doing it. The vulture wing is very square. And the wing here, the leading edge of it, slightly rounded. The feathers bend back. That's again a feature of buzzards or hawks. I wouldn't like to say exactly which bird this is. My supposition is it's a buzzard, the genus is Buteo, but which species, whether it's one of the typical North American ones or a vagrant, I wouldn't like to comment.
Dr. Rayner's view that it was probably a member of the buzzard family is rejected by the eyewitnesses. Like the boy who claims he was borne aloft by a big bird, Marlon Lowe, 10 years old at the time. The child's ordeal was front-page news in Illinois in 1977. Police who scoured the creeks and fields found nothing. But Marlon Lowe stands by his story. And his mother, Ruth, a countrywoman familiar with the local wildlife, says she knows the bird was no normal species.
I had never seen anything like it in my life. That just really scared me, because I thought that that bird was taking my son away. After I got a hold of him, I looked up underneath, and there was two birds. I thought they were big enough to take us both. I really, truly did. This bird was about 6 times bigger than a wild turkey. I had never, ever seen anything like this in my life.
The neck was like a California condor, because it had like that white collar around its neck like condor. It was like a grayish-black color, and it had like a white spot underneath on its belly. You know, I even seen turkey vultures at the creek, and there wasn't nothing like that bird that I seen in my life.
The condors, soaring birds native to the Americas. Only the albatross has a greater wingspan. Ever since Archaeopteryx, the first bird, took to the air 150 million years ago, the main problem for all bird life has been liftoff. Young birds must learn to use the invisible ebb and flow of air currents to get them airborne and to keep them up there. In the scientific world, meteorologists study these unseen forces. At the National Weather Service in Denver, Colorado, Eric Thaler is Science Operations Officer. His computers can reveal the powerful airstreams birds use to gain height, the thermals.
A thermal is just a spot where the ground gets very, very warm and the air there expands and rises and then gets filled in with air from surrounding areas. So you get the air kind of coming into a spot and then rising up. And of course, if you're light enough, like a bird, for example, you can get caught in this thermal and actually rise to great heights.
Since the dawn of history, humans have dreamt of flying like birds. Today's hang gliders in the gentle hills of Wisconsin use exactly the same invisible forces as big birds do. For like a bird, a hang glider pilot can only gain height if he can find rising air. To stay in the air, hang gliders and big birds must learn to find and navigate the thermals. Their lives depend on it.
Birds and hang gliders will exploit any sort of rising air. The ideal is to find a thermal. Now, a thermal is usually a circular, perhaps a donut-shaped chunk of air which is rising and travelling upwards. They're relatively small on geographical scales, maybe a few metres, tens of feet. And the birds have to stay in that, so once they've found one, they circle. The problem any large bird has is getting off the ground. It's got to jump, it's got to climb, gain height by its own efforts. And the bigger you are, the harder that is.
The invisible forces of aerodynamics keep birds as big as condors in flight. But even the condors would have been dwarfed by the teratons of the prehistoric world. Argentavis magnificens, the magnificent Argentine bird. Wingspan 25 feet. It's forced scientists to rethink their views on the maximum possible size for a flying bird.
The largest living birds have got a wingspan of perhaps 10, 12 feet. 4 metres is the figure usually quoted. But the fossil record has a number of species which were much bigger than this. The most famous is an animal called Argentavis, which comes from Argentina in the Miocene period, something like 8 to 10 million years old. And this is like a condor, except it's at least twice or 3 times the size. Certainly the bones look just like the bones of a condor scaled up. All the evidence is that this was a perfectly ordinary flying bird.
A real bird with a 25-foot wingspan. Yet before the discovery of Argentavis in 1979, scientists thought no such bird could ever fly. The upper weight limit for a bird capable of steady, flapping flight is around 26 pounds. Argentavis weighed 200 pounds. Argentavis had to rely on strong winds and high mountains to keep it airborne, using powerful thermals to soar and glide. That was 8 million years ago. But in the mountains of the Sierra Madre, could an unknown species of big bird survive? For big birds have been seen in Mexico. In the border town of Matamoros, a huge bird landed on the Barajas family farm.
I saw the big bird circling around and around. We were just standing there because we were so scared and frightened. Then we ran to tell my father, and he came running with his rifle, and the bird was still flying around. Then, as the bird flew lower, my father shot at it. It fell to the ground there by the mesquite tree.
This bird was very big. It had huge wings. Its feathers were gray like the color of lead. And the bird's beak was very big and very sharp.
I don't know what bird it was, because you never see birds like that, but it was big.
Terrified for their children's safety, the Barajas family abandoned their farm. But following the Mexican incident in 1976, there was a spate of sightings moving north, across the Texan border and into the United States. From the Sierra Madre in the south, the sightings followed two clear routes north. One through the Midwest to Illinois, where Marlon Lowe was attacked. The other further east, up through the Appalachians. There's a pattern here, and for weather scientist Eric Thaler, it's a pattern easy to recognize.
The satellite picture this morning pretty much shows us a pattern typical of the conditions in the United States. There's the air that's coming in off of the Atlantic here around this high pressure off here that comes this way and flow, then it comes in from the west like this, and these two currents sort of converge here and actually can create very strong winds up to 50, 70 knots across Texas and Mississippi, Alabama, into the Tennessee area and all the way up into the Great Lakes.
The pattern of the prevailing winds across North America is plain to see. And these winds help birds on their long migrations.
Periodically, warm air comes up from the south, associated with a lot of thunderstorm activities, very strong winds from a southerly direction over the Great Plains and the Midwest. A large bird would be well advised to find those winds. It'll get a free ride, a lot less energy, a much quicker passage. So birds are quite likely to appear in these places at about the same time as thunderstorms.
Birds tend to fly ahead of a storm. Weather scientists can watch them do it. Plotting the movement of weather systems by computer, scanning the skies by radar, Eric Thaler sees the birds on screen.
What we can see in this time lapse is a large area of thunderstorms off to the northwest of Houston that's developing and moving into this area. This is referred to as a squall line, just an area of very heavy rain, strong winds, thunder, lightning, quite a bit of intense weather. And all these smaller, less reflectivity echoes off the coast are actually birds that we're seeing. And it's kind of interesting that early on in this picture there's a gap between the squall line and where the birds are showing up, and evidently they're trying to avoid the squall line and stay away from the heavy weather.
In a thunderstorm, powerful forces pull the air upwards. This is the ultimate thermal. As the pressure plunges, huge swarms of insects are sucked up into the warm, humid air ahead of the storm. The insects attract hungry birds. Can this explain the ancient legend of the Thunderbirds? All across the Great Plains, the Native American peoples told tales of the giant Thunderbird. John Huffer, the ex-Marine cameraman who filmed the big birds, is chief of the Algonquin people in Illinois.
150 years ago, this was a natural place to stand because you could look out over this rolling prairie and it was covered with a beautiful grass that was about shoulder high. The Thunderbirds could come and they could look down into this grass and they could see our beloved buffalo, thousands and thousands of them, and that made many baby buffaloes. We watched for the big birds because if you were brave and saw the Thunderbird, it gave you strength.
60 million buffalo, hunted almost to extinction during the 19th century by white settlers. Their wings beat thunder. Their eyes flashed lightning. The Thunderbird symbolism of Native American tradition is found all over the Amerindian world. It's a legend that could overlay a fact, for the great buffalo herds of the plains would have offered a rich source of food to a migrating species of big bird.
If the season of thunderstorms occurs at the same time, say, as a bird migration, that can become linked. You can easily see how a myth could build up with that. No direct causality between the two, but it might be that the birds are using the same weather systems to migrate that is causing the thunder, or causing thunderstorms to travel about. There could be several explanations for why other animals are involved. Buffalo migrate. They move around according to where water and food is, where the grass is best. That could be seasonal, and in some places it could synchronize with the bird movements. Equally, the birds might be moving to find the buffalo herds because that's what they feed on.
Real big birds may once have followed the buffalo. But human farmers transformed the landscape from wild pasture to cultivated prairie. Did the birds survive? In North Carolina, the legend persists. The Cherokee people believed their ancestors cleared the Bald Mountains as lookouts in their defense against the fearsome giant bird who stole their children. Lloyd Ainich tells the story.
Well, in the old days, young children would go up in the mountains to play. And one day, the children had gone in the mountains, didn't come back. And the people started getting worried and knew something was taking their children. So they went to the medicine man to ask him what he could do. And he told them, go back to your homes and keep hidden. This night do not look out. So that night they went into their homes and they covered their eyes. Then they started seeing lightning, and with their eyes covered. They could see the lightning through their eyelids. And then the thunder came, and the thunder was louder. And it was so loud they had to cover their ears. And some of them started creeping over the doors, and they looked out. And they saw the lightning bolts striking the top of the mountains. And it would set the mountaintop on fire. And then the rains would come, and it'd come straight down and put the fires out. And this went on all night long. And the next morning they went out and they looked into the mountains. And they saw where all the mountains had been swept clean by the fires. And they went up and looked. And there on these mountains they found the bones of giant birds. And they knew these giant birds had been taking the children.
The ancient legend of a giant bird who took the people's children. The modern story of a small boy taken by a giant bird. Whatever attacked 10-year-old Marden Lowe in Lawndale, Illinois, was bigger than any known living bird. But the prehistoric world saw birds of incredible size, bigger than reported by Marlon Lowe. A real creature inside the myth of the Thunderbird.
Dedicated to our world's latest science and technology. Get the science behind the headlines on Discovery News and find up-to-date science information and facts on the web. Discovery News Briefs at discovery.com.
Once again, you are viewing the original footage of a living flying Thunderbird. These flying relics you are watching went CBS network television with Morton Dean. The TV shows made from this footage have caused much interest in the past 20 years. At the present time, the University of Texas is mounting an expedition to a remote mountain range in search of more living Thunderbirds. I, Chief AJ, am part of the expedition. If you would like to be part of the Thunderbird expedition, contact Chief AJ at 217-253-2959.